Rare case. The Supreme Court weighs alleged discrimination of pregnant women in the workplace. Building bridges. Pope Francis meets with Muslim and Catholic leaders gathered in Rome. Change of the guard. The leader of the Vatican Swiss Guard steps down next month. And Pearl Harbor remembered. Some of the last survivors recall that fateful day in 1941. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, December 3rd, 2014. Good evening from Washington. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick with your news now. The president and congressional leaders are promising to work together on taxes and immigration. But we're now learning that a minority within the Republican ranks might upend leadership's goal of bipartisan cooperation. Suzanne LaFranchi reports from the White House tonight. Suzanne?
The president is aware of the new political reality coming in January when Republicans will control both houses of Congress. The White House hopes that there will be room for compromise.
Speaking to a group of business leaders ahead of his meeting with incoming Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Obama says his agenda includes tax reform, infrastructure, and immigration.
Temperatures need to cool a little bit in the wake of my executive action. Certainly there will be pressure initially within Republican caucuses to try to reverse what I've done.
The Oval Office discussion is the first one-on-one meeting between the two since the midterms. Yesterday, McConnell said he had been perplexed by Obama's reaction to the election.
By any objective standard, the president got crushed in this election. So I've been perplexed by the reaction since the election, a sort of in-your-face, dramatic move to the left. So I don't know what we can expect in terms of reaching bipartisan agreements. That's my first choice, to look for the things that we actually agree on, if there are any.
Immigration hardliners in Congress are mounting a challenge to House Republican leaders' plans for legislation to keep the government running. They insist the bill include language blocking Obama's deportation relief to millions here illegally.
There's no reason on earth that we should be voting for a budget, any part of the budget that funds his illegal activities.
Word comes today that Texas is leading a group of 17 states suing the administration over the immigration plan. From the White House, Suzanne LaFranchi, EWTN News Nightly.
Now some of the other stories our EWTN News Nightly team has been covering in today's world. The Supreme Court takes up a pregnancy discrimination case that could impact many American women who continue working throughout their pregnancies. It's a case drawing attention from all sides, as Jason Calvi reports from the High Court.
When Peggy Young became pregnant in 2006, she asked her employer, UPS, to grant her lighter duties. The company refused, so she had to take unpaid leave.
We can work and be pregnant at the same time.
The question for the Supreme Court is whether UPS broke the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. The company has granted lighter duty to people injured on the job.
What Congress said is that employers have to treat pregnancy just as well as they treat any other disability on the job.
Stand with Peggy! Stand with Peggy!
The case is creating unlikely alliances, with groups like the ACLU and Planned Parenthood standing with Young, along with Americans United for Life.
The Pregnancy Discrimination Act protects a woman's ability to have a child in the workplace and protect her from the coercion of an employer or others to have an abortion so she can continue in her career.
UPS's lawyer says the policy isn't discrimination. Employees unable to work due to off-duty injuries would also have to take unpaid leave. Their position has support from business organizations.
We are concerned that if the court rules in Ms. Young's favor, there really will be no limits on what this accommodation has to look like and what that means for a small employer who really doesn't have all the levers that a UPS, quite frankly, has.
We expect a decision in this case by the end of the term in June. Now, UPS is changing their policy. Starting in January, they will let pregnant women have lighter duties. Here at the Supreme Court, Jason Calvi, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Jason. And Texas Catholic bishops are expressing appreciation for a federal appeals court decision to halt a scheduled execution. Condemned killer Scott Panetti's attorney says he's too delusional to be put to death. Today's reprieve came less than 8 hours before Panetti was set to receive a lethal injection. He was convicted of fatally shooting his estranged wife's parents 22 years ago. The Texas Attorney General's office says it won't fight the ruling. In a statement today, the Texas Catholic Conference of Bishops says, quote, the Texas bishops have long taught about the immorality of the death penalty and were particularly vocal seeking mercy for Panetti, who has been diagnosed by several doctors as suffering from severe mental illness, end quote. A grand jury in New York has reached its decision. New York City police officer Daniel Pantaleo will not be indicted for the July death of Eric Garner. Pantaleo, a white officer, had Garner, a black man, in a chokehold just before he died. New York City authorities are trying to avoid public riots over the ruling. They've sent representatives to Ferguson, Missouri to interview police there, hoping to avoid a repeat of that violence. Michael Brown's stepfather is under investigation for potentially inciting riots in Ferguson. Lewis Head's stepson was the 18-year-old African-American shot and killed by Officer Darren Wilson. Authorities say Head could face charges following a grand jury's decision not to indict Wilson. Head has since apologized publicly. He had called to burn the city of Ferguson to the ground. Family members say Head's reaction was inappropriate, but understandable. Well, airbag maker Takata insists it's not necessary, but Honda is expanding its recall of driver's side airbags to all 50 states. Takata has been defiant to demands by the federal regulators for this nationwide recall. The airbag units inflate with so much force that shrapnel can fly out of the airbag into the vehicle, causing injury or even death. At a congressional hearing today, a Takata official backed off some earlier claims that there's not enough evidence to support the nationwide recall.
We will take all actions necessary to advance the goal of safety for the driving public.
More than 16 million Honda vehicles have been recalled worldwide since 2008. At least 5 deaths have been linked to the faulty airbags made by Takata. A change in leadership is coming to the Vatican's Swiss Guard. The Vatican's official newspaper reports the commander of the soldiers who protect the Pope will step down at the end of next month. The Vatican gave no reason for the resignation of Daniel Rudolph Anrig, who has been serving since 2008. Some media speculate it has to do with his leadership style. The Swiss Guard was established by Pope Julius II in 1506 for his personal defense. It's been serving the Holy Father ever since. Our Holy Father met today with Muslim and Catholic leaders attending meetings hosted by the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue. The Prince of Jordan, among others, is in that group. This is their 3rd summit. The goal is to foster fraternity and strengthen ties between religions. And Pope Francis says the truth must prevail in the case of a former Vatican ambassador to the Dominican Republic who's accused of abusing young boys. The Holy Father met with the nation's top prosecutor after his general audience today. The Holy See recalled Joseph Wesolowski last year after rumors surfaced in Santo Domingo that he abused boys. Wesolowski has been stripped of his priestly faculties. He is under house arrest inside Vatican City, pending a decision by the Vatican Criminal Court on whether or not to indict him. We're joined by Austen Ivereigh, founder of Catholic Voices, and for once the Vatican is getting some praise for its handling of the sex abuse crisis. Is this because the media loves Pope Francis or because what the Vatican is actually doing is right?
I think a bit of both. Remember that most sex abuse cases are the responsibility of bishops. Here was one case where you had a Vatican representative, in other words, directly under the authority of the Vatican. Here was an opportunity for Pope Francis to demonstrate that there is no place in the priesthood for abusers, and he did it swiftly, without any doubt, and acted in a way that impressed the Dominican authorities. I do think this is probably the beginning of many examples which Pope Francis wants to see of the Catholic Church setting an example to other organizations in how it deals with abusers.
You just wrote a biography about Pope Francis. He is really focused on bringing the religions together. Has this been a focus throughout his priestly life, throughout his entire life, maybe?
It's extraordinary. He has a tremendous capacity for building relationships across the barriers of religion, of politics, of culture, and he operates through friendships. He has that capacity. He's done it all his life, and he's doing it again now as Pope.
So in your book, The Great Reformer, you talk about the conclave, and the Vatican is explicitly denying the claims in your book that there was a campaign among cardinals to elect Bergoglio as Pope. What do you know about that conclave that cause you to make those claims?
I'm grateful for the opportunity to clarify this, because I'm sorry for one phrase that I wrote, which has led to misunderstanding. What I said was that unlike the previous conclave, at this time in 2013, a group of cardinals who wanted to see him elected, I said they sought his assent. Now, in fact, they didn't actually ever specifically ask him, because that would have been against the conclave rules. But they did at least feel that this time he wouldn't resist his election if he were chosen. So what I've recounted in the book for the first time is the story of how a group of cardinals promoted him as a possible pope. This happens in every conclave. It happened in 2005 when there was another group of cardinals promoting Joseph Ratzinger to become Pope Benedict XVI. And I'm very confident, because I get it from very good sources, that this is what happened. But he had no participation at all in the election. He didn't cooperate in any way. He had no participation in it. And this will be, I will correct that in future editions. And I'm sorry for any misunderstanding that it's caused.
You call him a radical pope, the great reformer. Did the cardinals know who they were electing when they elected Bergoglio Pope Francis?
They wanted a governor. They wanted somebody who could carry out immediate necessary reforms in the Vatican. They also wanted somebody who could liberate the church's ability to evangelize. And that were the two things that they got with Pope Francis. I think even they have been surprised by many of the things that he's done and the way the world has taken to him. But I think actually what Pope Francis is doing is what the cardinals before his election asked him to do.
We'll talk more about what exactly he's reforming the next time you're with us. We'll get into this book, The Great Reformer, Francis and the Making of a Radical Pope. Austen Ivereigh, thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Brian.
Well, coming up, with recent Islamic State kidnappings, we're going to talk to a former Bush administration official about U.S. hostage policy. Wednesday, December 3rd, thanks for joining us for EWTN News Nightly. I'm Brian Patrick. Pro-democracy protest leaders surrender to police today in Hong Kong. The three founders of Hong Kong's Occupy Central movement were not charged. They were allowed to leave the police station freely. Protests have been going on in Hong Kong streets for more than 2 months. These three men are asking demonstrators to go home, claiming the situation has become too dangerous. Despite their appeals, some young protesters still occupying 2 Hong Kong sites are showing no sign of giving up. A Palestinian teen is accused of stabbing 2 Israelis in a supermarket today. The teen was shot in the legs by a security guard. The 2 shoppers were taken to a Jerusalem hospital. Their wounds are described as moderate. 11 people have been killed in Palestinian attacks, mainly in Jerusalem, over the past month. Well, the head of a UN agency is calling for a ban on the trafficking of cultural objects from Iraq and Syria. The official is with the agency that protects World Heritage Sites. The agency says objects stolen from the conflict zones in those countries are worth billions of dollars. The head of UNESCO says extremist groups use that money to fund their operations. Well, recent high-profile kidnappings by the Islamic State have drawn attention to the United States' hostage policies. The issue gained momentum in May with the U.S. trading 5 Taliban detainees for Sergeant Bo Bergdahl's release. In August, the family of journalist James Foley, kidnapped 2 years earlier in Syria, receives a message that their son will be executed. Days later, ISIL releases a video showing Foley's beheading. The Foley family expressed concern over the lack of communication from the White House. Then in September, a video showing the beheading of Stephen Sotloff is released. The White House responds, declaring its intention to degrade and destroy ISIS. Just last month, ISIS releases yet another video showing the beheading of a U.S. aid worker, Peter Kassig, captured in October 2013. The following day, the White House announces a review of its hostage policy and procedures focusing on family engagement, intelligence collection, and diplomacy. Dr. Dane Eglis is the author of Beyond the Storms and a former senior hostage advisor to the Bush administration. Are we reading too much into this idea that the hostage policy is getting another look over right after all these kidnappings?
I don't think so. This is something we always do in the government. We should be reviewing our policy habitually. It's something that is appropriate to do in this case because there's been a surge in beheadings, and it's a good practice.
Did you do that in the Bush administration?
Absolutely. As I chaired the hostage working group, you assembled the interagency work players, and you always take a look at, are you giving the president the very best recommendations? Is the policy adequate for the current operational conditions?
The U.S. has taken a very hard line regarding ransom. We don't pay ransom for hostage. What else can be done to try to free a hostage?
Well, we do a lot of other things. It's just that we don't do what the terrorists do. What they do openly to terrorize, to shock, and their propaganda campaign, we do privately other things with our special forces. We collect intelligence, and we try to make it as painful as possible for them to continue their enterprise. And first and foremost, do not underwrite or fund what they're doing.
So this is being done behind the scenes.
Correct.
We don't know about any of this. What we do know is what they're putting in front of us. They have an entire media arm. We've seen that horrific beheading videos. I mean, they've used multiple cameras to shoot those. I mean, is this something that these terrorists are really growing into, using media to rally the cause that they're after?
Absolutely. This is a generation of terrorists unlike any we've seen before. They are far more sophisticated in their social media skills. They are going to use what they can to their advantage. And one of their strategic advantages for their campaign is to put all this out there in every media avenue they can.
Yeah, they can reach people that, 10 years ago people couldn't reach. What about this relationship with the hostage families? We heard from some that they didn't have any communication with the government. What was your experience with that?
We worked hard, and I'm sure they're doing the same thing now, to maintain communications with the family. It's a very vexing issue. It's troubling, frustrating for all parties. The best thing you can do is have an FBI negotiator or liaison. Keep close contact, but we can't share very much with them. So there is an inherent frustration on both parts. We can't really reveal too much, and their hunger for as much information as possible. But we just assure them that we use every instrument of national security to try and gain their release, but we don't offer concessions. But we do a lot of other things that we can't talk about.
Insight from a man who knows, Dr. Dane Egley, the author of Beyond the Storms, a Homeland Security story, and we appreciate you joining us here on EWTN News Nightly.
My pleasure.
Up next, on this 5th anniversary of the imprisonment of an American in Cuba, we look at that island nation's oppression of religious freedom. On this 3rd day of December, we celebrate the feast of Jesuit missionary St. Francis Xavier. His conversion came after meeting St. Ignatius Loyola. He brought the faith to the Far East in the 16th century. Thanks for joining us on this Wednesday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. And the White House calls on Cuba to release American detainee Alan Gross, exactly 5 years after his imprisonment there. Gross was doing contract work in Cuba with the U.S. Agency for International Development. He's been held since December 3rd, 2009. His family now says Gross is threatening a hunger strike. He believes he'll die in prison if he isn't freed by his 66th birthday, which is in May. Cuba remains under U.S. economic embargo and is listed as a state sponsor of terrorism. The White House says Gross's release could remove a barrier to better relations between the two countries. Richard Coll is foreign policy advisor for Latin America with the U.S. Bishop's Office of International Justice and Peace. Victor Gaetan is the international correspondent for our news partner, the National Catholic Register. So, Victor, it's been 5 years since Alan Gross was detained. What do you think is standing in the way of his freedom?
What is standing in the way of Alan Gross's freedom is what is standing in the way of millions of Cuban people, a communist dictatorship. The case, the tragedy of Alan Gross and his family is the tragedy of millions of Cubans, which are suppressed by a heartless regime, by a regime that doesn't believe in life, doesn't believe in suffering, that has for 55 years now exercised a dictatorship.
More than 5 decades of this oppression. So, Richard, describe what Catholics in Cuba live with today.
It's a very difficult situation. I think that they are allowed to practice their faith. That was certainly our experience when a delegation of bishops from the Bishops' Conference visited there in 2012, but it is under very controlled circumstances and certainly greater freedom to practice their religion, particularly outside of the confines of their local churches, would be a very necessary first step.
So I'm sure it's necessary to try to work with this regime. How do you do that? How does the church do that in light of how these Catholics are being suppressed and oppressed?
It's a great question. The Church's position, both at the level of the Vatican as well as the Catholic and indeed the U.S. conference here in the United States, has been one of dialogue and negotiation. We do so in part because that is our faith. We believe in dialogue, we believe in redemption, but also it's been our experience, notably in Eastern Europe, that dialogue and reconciliation often leads to reform in the regimes in question.
From the Catholic Church's perspective, there have been indeed signs of progress, quote unquote.
You visited recently, haven't you?
I have.
2010, I guess.
Yes, and the Catholic Church indeed has been able to get what we call space, meaning that people can meet in churches, can meet in being tolerated in certain homes where they practice charity. They even talk about the disaster of abortion, which in Cuba is a practice at the level of genocide. So from the Catholic Church's point of view, in particular since John Paul II's visit in 1998, which was reinforced by the visit of Pope Benedict in 2012, the Church has made some gains. There are certain religious holidays that are respected today by the regime. However, the regime continues to punish, to persecute, to arrest anybody who would be in any way taking a different stand in the policy direction, to the point where every Sunday in front of the Santa Rita Church in Havana, a major church, the ladies in white, those ladies, the sisters and the wives and the mothers of the men who protest against the church would be humiliated, would be beaten up, would be arrested, even if it's for temporary.
So there's some progress, but there's certainly a long way to go. We appreciate the insight that both of you have added. Victor Gaetan, Richard Coll, thanks for joining us tonight.
Great pleasure.
Well, this Sunday marks Pearl Harbor Day, the Japanese attack on the U.S. fleet in Hawaii. The 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor was called a day that shall live in infamy. That couldn't be more true for four men who remember it vividly.
All those bombs blew us. It didn't kill us, but it blew us something awful.
More than 1,100 sailors and Marines died on the USS Arizona that day. Tuesday, 4 of the 9 remaining survivors, all in their 90s, gathered for a reunion in Hawaii.
Well, I think that my wife saves quarters every year from the time we have the reunion until the next year for her Mai Tais, and she's already saving them for next year. So,
John Anderson, Louis Conter, Don Stratton, and Lauren Bruner watched a live video feed from the sunken battleship and described their injuries.
I went to get a gun permit and I found out I didn't have any fingerprints.
This was the last official USS Arizona Reunion Association gathering. That's something that's not stopping these survivors.
Well, it won't be the last reunion as far as the men go.
The men plan to observe Pearl Harbor Day on Sunday with a bottle of wine given to them by President Gerald Ford in 1975. The last of the greatest generation. We salute them. Until tomorrow, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, watch again on EWTN's YouTube page. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, I'm Brian Patrick. We leave you tonight with these snapshots from Pope Francis's general audience in St. Peter's Square tonight. Good night and God bless you.